Before we begin, 3 points. 1. Hegel informs us not only that religion contains and is the ground of all the shapes that have preceded, e.g. self-consciousness, reason, and spirit, but that absolute knowing, the final shape, is the truth and ground of religion itself, and likewise contains all that preceded, including religion. 2. In our first lecture, we said the goal of the phenomenology, the science of the experience of consciousness, is absolute knowing and the absolute concept. And this means that the concept, aka thought, the self, consciousness, the I, is all reality and all that exists, and is the singular result of our exit from Plato's cave. The concept is the standpoint of absolute science and the beginning of the science of logic. The concept, or self, thought, etc., first emerged as the object or reality at the end of perception in A consciousness as the unconditioned universal, and then became the main focus in B self-consciousness. Finally, in C, the unity of A and B, of consciousness and self-consciousness, we had reason as the certainty that consciousness, the I, is all reality, which Hegel also called the category, the unity of the I, self-consciousness, and being. We also noted that reason and the category, etc., did not become all reality until we reached spirit, and then only at the close of spirit in conscience, evil, and forgiveness, where we had the reciprocal recognition of acting and judging conscience, which became absolute spirit, God, and Reich Gottes, and brought the phenomenology to a close, i.e. for us, not for consciousness itself. What we learned, the key to the book, is that absolute spirit, spirit knowing itself as spirit, requires at least 2 selves who recognize each other as equals and as equally all reality. As Hegel said, each self or conscience is a UI, a unity of universality and individuality. That is, each self is the concept itself, which sees only itself in its opposite. We thus have here one pure knowing, knowing another pure knowing. It is precisely by enlisting this conceptual recognition that Hegel will solve the issue of the overcoming of the believer's alienation and separation from the absolute being or God. This knowing of knowing is also the key to 3, absolute knowing, and its final result, that there is only one concept, one self, one consciousness. In brief, Hegel says in The Science of Logic that science, quote, presupposes the opposition of consciousness to an object has been overcome, end quote. And in the Phenomenology's introduction, that the goal is, quote, the point where knowing no longer needs to go beyond itself, end quote. This happens precisely when knowing or consciousness and its object can no longer be distinguished from each other. And this happens precisely in the reciprocal recognition of the two consciences, where both, as pure knowing, are absolutely the same, there being no difference between them. As a result, they both collapse into one knowing, one self, one consciousness, one concept, that is, into absolute knowing. Okay, part one. Let's now see in paragraphs 790 to 793 how the self will come to see itself first in the object that is the world. Hegel begins by saying that the object must be known as self in its immediacy, qua sense certainty, in its determinacy or relation, qua perception, and in its essence or universality, qua understanding. Hegel reminds us that, first, in observing reason, the outcome was that, quote, the I, or self, is a thing, a, quote, sensuous immediate thing, e.g. a skull, meaning that the self, or self-consciousness, is in itself the objectively real world. Second, in pure insight, enlightenment, and utility, the thing, or object, became totally transcended. As Hegel says, quote, in itself, the thing is nothing and has meaning only in relation and through the I, end quote. Indeed, the cultivated self-consciousness, which has traversed the world of self-alienated spirit, has produced the thing as its own self, end quote. And note, by thing is meant this pen, this planet, in fact, everything. The whole universe is nothing but self. Finally, Hegel reminds us that in moral self-consciousness, quote, the thing is known as self, not only qua immediacy and qua determinacy, but qua essence or inner being, end quote. That is, the moral self knows that its knowledge is alone essential. Quote, that being, thinghood, the object, is simply and solely pure willing and knowing, end quote. And as conscience, it knows that its existence is the pure certainty of itself, that the objective element into which it puts itself when it acts is nothing other than the self's pure knowledge of itself, end quote. Thus, we have the first of the two reconciliations of consciousness and self-consciousness. The self sees nothing but itself in the object that is the world. And this is spirit in its own world. That is, the world is nothing but spirit. Spirit and the world are one.